Today we talk about how a single hCG test can predict the outcome of an IVF pregnancy, giving hope or setting expectations right from the start.
I'm Dr. Mark Amos, and this is Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.
When undergoing fertility treatments, the 2-week wait to find out if you're pregnant can feel like an eternity. But what if a single blood test could give you a strong indication of whether your pregnancy will continue or not? Well, research has shown that hCG levels at just 16 days after ovulation can be a powerful predictor of success. And today, we're going to dive into the science behind these numbers, what they really mean, and how can they guide your expectations. Whether you're in the midst of an IVF cycle or just curious about the science of early pregnancy, this episode is for you. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of what hCG levels mean what, let's talk about what is the purpose of hCG. I don't think you're going to be surprised that God didn't make hCG just to use it as a pregnancy test. It's actually a very critical function in early pregnancy. It's produced from the placental cells, specifically the syncytiotrophoblastic cells, usually starting around 6 to 8 days post-fertilization. And the purpose of this hormone is to mimic luteinizing hormone, LH. And the purpose of that is to keep the corpus luteum from degrading. See, every month when you ovulate, the sac that releases the egg ends up producing progesterone. And that sac will stick around for approximately 2 weeks. And then it will degrade. And when it degrades, the progesterone levels will drop, and that will lead to a menses. However, when you get pregnant, you do not want it to drop. Otherwise, you would lose the pregnancy. So to stop the corpus luteum from degrading, the placenta cells make hCG, which looks like the hormone LH, which the body was producing before to make the progesterone, but now it's being produced by the baby. And that keeps the corpus luteum from degrading, which keeps progesterone levels up and keeps the pregnancy moving forward. Essentially, hCG rescues the corpus luteum, allowing it to continue producing progesterone until the placenta can take over around 8 to 10 weeks of pregnancy. Prior to that point, it is the corpus luteum that's producing all the progesterone needed for the pregnancy, which is being run by the hCG from the syncytiotrophoblasts of the placenta. This is very important when you start talking about bleeding in pregnancy. When you get pregnant naturally, if something goes wrong with the baby, then that means hCG will not be produced by the placenta, which will lead to a progesterone drop, which will then lead to the pregnancy being lost and bleeding. But when you do fertility treatment, sometimes you take progesterone. And that progesterone will be there regardless if the pregnancy is doing well or not. Meaning, the corpus luteum doesn't need to have hCG to keep going. So if something's wrong with the baby and the hCG levels drop, there won't be a drop in the progesterone triggering bleeding. Instead, you could technically have a miscarriage and never know it without a drop of blood because the progesterone you are giving is what's protecting the pregnancy and protecting you from bleeding. This is why some miscarriages that occur in fertility treatment will occur without any bleeding at all. Overall, the point is, hCG is not just a pregnancy marker. It's actually a signal that rescues the corpus luteum to keep it alive and sustain the pregnancy in the earliest weeks until later when the placenta can be self-sufficient and produce all the progesterone it needs by itself. This is also the reason why when you ovulate, whether you're doing a modified natural FET or IUI, you only need to supplement the progesterone, which can be vaginal, versus when you're doing a frozen embryo transfer and you're not ovulating, you need to support the progesterone completely because you're not supplementing, you're providing all of it. The idea for this podcast came from a published article in the Journal of Fertility and Sterility. It was volume 73, issue 2 in February of 2000. And it was titled Human Chorionic Gonadotropin as a Predictor of Outcome in Assisted Reproductive Technology Pregnancies. Essentially, can hCG level tell us whether the pregnancy has a better chance to continue or to not? So let's break down what the study did show. It was a retrospective analysis of 662 ART pregnancies, meaning fertility treatment pregnancies. Retrospective means it wasn't done prospectively where they had pregnancies and saw what happened. Instead, they looked back at data of prior pregnancies in the past, and that's how they analyzed the data. They measured hCG at just one point, day 16 post-ovulation. This would correspond to 10 days after an embryo transfer. And the goal of the study was to determine if a single hCG test could predict pregnancy outcome. Now, this is important to understand. This does not mean that these things say that your pregnancy will go good or go bad. It's just saying if you only have one number, what would it predict? So let's talk about the key findings. Essentially, when they looked at the hCG level, they broke up into categories: 25 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 200, 200 to 500, 500 to 1,000, and greater than 1,000. When you were looking at the 25 to 50 international units per liter, they found that the ongoing pregnancy rate probability was less than 35%, and that the miscarriage rate was greater than 65%. When they looked at the 50 to 100 international units per liter, they found that the ongoing pregnancy rate was 35 to 64%, and that the miscarriage rate was 36 to 65%. When they looked at the 100 to 200 international units of hCG per liter, they found that 64 to 80% of the pregnancies had ongoing probability, and that the miscarriage risk was down to 20 to 36%. When they looked at 200 to 500 international units per liter, the ongoing pregnancy probability was 80 to 95%, and now the miscarriage rate was only 5 to 20%. Now, when they looked at 500 international units to 1,000, in that category, 95 to 100% had ongoing pregnancies, and the miscarriage risk was only 0 to 5%. And when they looked at people with over 1,000 for that first hCG level, 100% had ongoing pregnancy rates, and the miscarriage rate was 0. So let's talk about what this means. Does this mean if your hCG is under 50 that you're not going to have a successful pregnancy? Not at all. It's just saying statistically, if you take a group of people and you look at their hCG levels and it's below 50, then the ongoing pregnancy rate ends up dropping less than 50%, specifically under 35%. Now, it's important to understand that it has to be 16 days post-ovulation. If you do your hCG early, it's going to be lower. If you put back 2 embryos, it may be higher than expected. There are even some studies that show that when you do PGT, that by biopsying the embryo, you actually can lower the hCG levels a little bit. And it's also important to understand this is a range. They're not saying under 50. So what that means is that it could be 30, 40, 45, up to 50, and there could be slight differences between those, but as a group, under 50 is under 35. Although I don't have the data, I would suspect if you were 48, it probably was very similar to the group that was around 50. So the largest takeaway from this is that if the hCG is below 50 international units per liter, the pregnancy is highly unlikely to continue, but that doesn't mean in your specific situation. It's just in general. But if the hCG is above 500, then the chances of an ongoing pregnancy is very high. Now, it's important to understand they didn't look at things like doubling of the hCG. They didn't look at progesterone levels. In fact, they didn't even factor in age as much. All of these things can definitely factor. It doesn't matter if your first hCG is 500. If it is 500, but it's not doubling, something could be wrong. The same thing, it was noted that women who were over 40 years of age needed higher hCG levels compared to their peers who were younger than them to have the same probability of ongoing pregnancy. Now, as you can see, 50 to 500 is a very wide range. Most people don't fall into that. Most people might be 100. Maybe they're 300. The reason they chose such wide points is because then they could show that at the extreme sides, there is some major difference. The other point to consider is whether you did PGTA. Not just is the hCG level going to be lower, but we also know the miscarriage risk is going to be lower. Like all studies, you have to evaluate whether it had strength and where the weaknesses were. In this study, there were some good things. For example, the sample size was good at 662 pregnancies. Additionally, I like the fact that they standardized the timing of the blood draw at 16 days post-ovulation. This ensures consistency so we're comparing apples to apples. I also like the idea that it was broad, the fact that it wasn't just IVF but also IUIs. And they also used logistic regression. It was a strong statistical method for binary outcomes, which helps support their claims. Now, the limitations of the study is the fact that it was retrospective, meaning it wasn't randomized, so there's the potential for selection bias. They also didn't analyze hCG doubling rates, which is another important factor and I feel could definitely affect the results. They also didn't control for confounders like the embryo quality or PGT or underlying fertility conditions that may affect it as well. The other thing was during the study, they did change the hCG testing method, which may cause some inconsistency. Overall, I give the study a B+. Clinically useful, but not the gold standard when it comes to studies. I would love to see a prospective randomized study and maybe confirm some of the confounders that could be affecting it, but I understand why they didn't do that because it wasn't a large enough sample size to be able to add all those other things. So the most important question for you is, how can you use this data? I think overall, it can just help with your expectations. In the end, always talk to your doctor because they're going to look at things like if the hCG is doubling and also look at your situation. Someone who's never had a miscarriage or someone who has had multiple miscarriages are going to have different expectations. And I'm not going to rely on just a number. At our clinic, we tell people as long as it's 50, we feel pretty good. Now, that doesn't mean if I see 200, I don't feel good too, but I also don't feel amazing because it's higher. They use a very high cutoff rate for showing things are great, but in reality, that's not a number most people get. It's like saying, well, if you play basketball and you're 6 foot, you're going to do very well. But if you're 10 feet tall, well, then you're going to definitely do well. Well, that's a very extreme height. And so sure, it's going to give you a high probability of success, but it's not very reasonable. And that's what I felt with the study. 500 is not a very common number people say on their first hCG level. If you really want to know how things are going, you look at the doubling rates, you look at the initial hCG, and you look at other factors like the quality of the embryo, and also if they did PGTA. No matter what, you always want to repeat the hCG. At our clinic, we even now check it a third time. So we don't even just look for doubling, but we check a third time. And that's because when we first started, we would just do the first two hCGs, and as long as they doubled, we would set everyone up for an OB scan. And about 1% of the time or less, we would start seeing people come in and there'd be no baby in the uterus. So after that, we then added it to a third test. And after doing that, we rarely ever see someone come in and not see a pregnancy in the uterus. And that's because we now know with 3 data points, it's very unlikely that it's just going to be a chemical miscarriage. So, does a low hCG always mean miscarriage? Not always. But there's an increased risk. Can a high hCG level predict twins? Yeah, sometimes it can, but it's not definitive. And can this test guarantee then a healthy pregnancy? Well, the answer to that is no. It only predicts the likelihood, not the viability. Think of it as an odds predictor. Overall, use this study to help you predict the success of the pregnancy and understand that hCG is more than just a test. It's a lifeline of the early pregnancy. And although the single number that you get 16 days post-ovulation may be a strong predictor, but the best way to predict is by looking at doubling levels, talking to your doctor so they can take the whole picture and put that together to really give you the right expectations. If you found this episode helpful, share it with someone going through IVF or maybe some fertility treatment. If you have questions about the hCG, reach out to your doctor and ask them. Fertility is a very stressful journey, and hopefully this episode will help you feel a little bit more comfortable when you see the hCG level. Don't be worried if it's not 500 above. Again, that's not very common. They picked that number because it was able to then say, oh look, these all do very well. But in reality, most people will not be at 500. But most are usually above 100. And what the study showed was that if you're above 100, you're looking at an 80% chance of potentially having a successful pregnancy. As always, if you like this podcast, please tell us about it. We really like to hear that. Tell your friends about it. And as always, give a 5-star review on your favorite medium. The most important thing is to keep coming back. I look forward to talking to you again next week on Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.